So we're going to be talking about dispositors and significators, the plot structure of the life script. Now, as I was starting to say, we can think actually of the astrological chart as a kind of personal narrative, as a symbolic portrait of our life story. And it's replete with all the fundamental elements that go into making a good story. The planets are the characters, both inner and outer, and they're motivated by particular psychological needs. In fact, we can think of the signs that the planets rule as constituting the underlying drive or need or motive that inspires that particular character's actions. Characters, of course, have to operate or perform their roles in a particular setting, and that's where we look at the houses as the context or the background for the actions of the planets. The planets are the actors, planets in sign perform their actions in particular ways, and the house again is the setting of the background. In addition, we can think of aspects as constituting relationships between the characters. So externally, they can actually show up as particular kinds of relationships that we have with whoever represents those archetypes or whatever institution represents those archetypes in the outer world. But at the same time, they represent the internal dialogues or the self-talk that we engage in, and also symbolize those inevitable certain core conflicts that every chart, to one degree or another, symbolizes, and the moral lessons that are implicit within those conflicts. That, again, kind of contributes to the main theme or the lesson, the moral of the story. However, if we just looked at every planet in the chart, even with regard to the aspects that it makes, its sign position, its house position, we'd have like 10 scenes in a movie. And each scene would be operating in parallel with all the other scenes in the movie, but they wouldn't necessarily be connected to form an intelligible story. So the fundamental rule here is that planetary scenes and conflicts are not sufficient in themselves to glean or understand the story as a whole, because the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. In fact, we could even say that the number one problem, in my opinion, in astrology is this kind of a tendency to reason from the part to the whole, to look at some part of the chart and assume that we can make some statement about that part that is relevant to or descriptive of some, the person as a whole. Now, to some degree, maybe you can get away with that on occasion, and the client is likely to identify themselves with the description offered pertaining to that particular planetary configuration. But if you accept the idea that every piece of the chart is related to every other part of the chart, so that all these relationships constitute a whole, a synergistic whole greater than the sum of its parts, every part is affecting or influencing every other part. And so until you can really glean the story as a whole, you have to be very tentative, very cautious in arriving at any kind of final interpretations with regard to some particular part of the chart. Now this means, in effect, you have to have a certain tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty until you get the story from the client as a whole. Now, I'm not going to be getting into counseling so much here, but one of the ways that I really work that I think is important is to ask a lot of questions in the beginning and try to get a sense of who the client is, what their story is, even if it's just in kind of the bare bones, before you actually get into interpreting the chart, because the more you can know about the client, the more that chart is going to light up and come alive in a more full three-dimensional way as a whole than it could if you're just playing guesswork.